Hello, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, for joining us here today. My name is Richard Nephew. I am the Program Director for Economic, Statecraft, Sanctions, and Energy Markets here at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Today, we're quite pleased to bring Dan Freed, the Coordinator for Sanctions Policy at the U.S. Department of State, and my former boss, up here to have a conversation with folks about Russia, Ukraine, and U.S. sanctions policy. Let me say first that this event, like all of those at the center, is being webcast live, and both the full video and podcast recording will be available on our website and on iTunes in the next couple of days. And for all of you watching online, you can ask a question of Dan at any time using the hashtag CGEPEvents, our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy, and my Twitter handle at rnephewcgep, C-G-E-P. Dan is the inaugural coordinator for sanctions policy at the State Department, having accepted the role from Secretary Clinton in one of her last acts as Secretary of State. He's been coordinator for 3 years, during a time in which there has been tremendous growth in U.S. sanctions policy and U.S. sanctions action, ranging everything from Russia, Ukraine, to cyber threats, to both Iran in the active sense and then Iran in the dismantling sense. So he's definitely seen a lot of the issues associated with modern sanctions policy coming through his desk. Dan's personal history in the State Department goes back much farther than that. He's a career Foreign Service officer, started off in 1977, really primarily focused on Russia, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and then the post-Soviet Union. He was a director and senior director at the National Security Council for Central and Eastern Europe from 1993 to 1997, overseeing a time of tremendous change in Europe and Eastern Europe in particular. After that, he became U.S. Ambassador to Poland until 2000. From 2001 to 2005, he went back to the White House to serve as Senior Director for European and Eurasian Affairs. And then from 2005 until 2009, he was the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. From 2009 to 2013, he served as the Special Envoy for Guantanamo detainees, and a duty expanded in 2011 by taking on the issue of Camp Ashraf in Iraq and the MEK. Dan is here to offer us his views on Russia, Ukraine, sanctions, and the path forward. After his prepared remarks, I'll take the privilege of asking him a few questions, and then we'll turn things over to the audience, including the audience that's following us online. So with that, Dan?
Okay. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that I spent a lot of time in this building from 1975 to 1977 at the School of International and Public Affairs and the Russian Institute, which was the Harriman Institute before it got a lot of money. I don't know, I can't remember if I've been in this building since that time, but it looks familiar. I started out in this building, and there are a number of my Foreign Service colleagues, State Department colleagues also went through. So for you students of SEPA or the Harriman Institute, you may have interesting future ahead. Maybe in this town, maybe in others. Sanctions. I am not really a sanctions expert, though I've learned a lot in the past 3 years. Richard is, in fact, a sanctions expert. But as I said, I've learned a lot. And I'm going to start off with some observations about sanctions as a foreign policy tool, because sanctions are the popular new policy kit on the block. Okay? They seem to have worked. In fact, I'd argue they most certainly worked with respect to Iran. And the deal we got was in part the result of the pressure of sanctions, and in part the result of diplomacy, and the two went together. And that is basically the first lesson of sanctions. Sanctions support a policy and make sense and are effective to the degree the policy they are intended to support makes sense, and obviously not otherwise. Sanctions are supposed to change the behavior of the state or the organization you're sanctioning. They're not intended to be a punishment. They're not a club. They are a lever to be used, again, in support of a policy. So here are the sanctions do's and don'ts, and if reality gets in the way of rules, follow reality, but rules, like all rules, are supposed to guide you. And these are our sanctions do's and don'ts in my office that I worked out partly in discussions with Richard as he was training me up in sanctions. One is, don't be in a hurry. Sanctions can work, but they take time. And in particular, they don't easily accommodate themselves to the news cycle or even our own political cycle. Policy-making time is not linear. That is, something doesn't work and suddenly it does. In my day, in Eastern Europe, nothing worked through the 1980s, and then everything worked in 1989. So if your three-year policy horizon was 1983 to 1986, we were all losers and failures. And if your policy horizon was 1987 to 1990, we were all geniuses. So the sanctions can work, but not according to your timetable or the timetable you may have put in your last policy memo to the Secretary or the President. Second don't is, don't be greedy. Don't look for an overwhelming, catastrophic victory where the other guy runs up the white flag, and you get a quick and wonderful win that you get to nail to your wall. Policy making is not like that. You usually get enough of a success to go on to the next set of awful problems. Don't be greedy. Sanctions are a tool, but in policy making, success, like failure, is usually relative. Third don't is, don't look for purity, by which I mean sanctions sometimes have unintended consequences and they always have costs. Now, these can and should be mitigated and managed, and we try, but they can't be wished away. So don't oversell sanctions. They have costs. And therefore, fourth don't default to sanctions. They're not a panacea. They're not automatic. Now, sometimes sanctions are described as a middle option between passivity and military options. Yeah, maybe, but that doesn't mean that sanctions are the right tool under all circumstances. You have to think it through. And as I said up front, you have to embed sanctions in an overall policy that makes sense, and that overall policy had better include something more than just sanctions. All right, so those are the don'ts. What are the do's? First do is multilateral is better. The gold standard of sanctions is a Security Council resolution, and we just got one on North Korea, and a very good one. And so cooperation in the UN on tough stuff is possible. It's possible today. It's possible when powers such as the US, Russia, China have interests at stake. We got it. And we didn't get the lowest common denominator. It's a strong UNSCR. And I can say this, it's not self-serving remark because I had almost nothing to do with negotiating it. The credit belongs to our people in New York and to Ambassador Sam Power. UNSCRs are the gold standards, but they're not the only standard. If you can't get a Security Council resolution, the best second best is sanctions which are regional, G7, European and American, or combination of all of the above. Go for multilateral, which is another way of saying that unilateral sanctions are usually not a good idea. I won't say never. Sometimes unilateral sanctions, something you have to do, but they're not what you should try to do. Unilateral sanctions are the weakest. Multilateral is better, the silver standards. Smart sanctions are essential. You have to think through the sanctions. You have to think about the impact, the relative impact, the hit on you, the hit on your friends, and the hit on the intended target. Hit the intended target and do something in sanctions that you're willing to sustain. And third is invest in a capacity to run a sanctions program. Doing smart sanctions requires resources. Now, the United States has built up resources, and this, again, I've never worked there, so it's not self-serving. Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control OFAC, is actually a first-rate organization. They're not the only outfit that does sanctions, but they're the principal one that does financial sanctions. They're actually very good. They're professional, smart, thorough. You can trust their judgment. But it takes resources. You have to populate it. You got to have people there. They have to be trained. They have to be supported. They have to be in place for a long time to develop a corporate expertise, and you better cherish it because you're going to need it. You're going to need it because, by the way, sanctions are challengeable in court, and you don't want to lose cases. Another do is make messaging clear. Be clear why you're sanctioning, what your intent is, and what it will take to lift sanctions, which brings me to my next do, which is know when to end them. The purpose of sanctions is to create conditions under which you can take away the sanctions. They're not intended to be permanent. And if they're permanent, then they haven't really worked out so well. Know when to end them, how to end them, make sure you can end them. You're watching a successful implementation of that principle with respect to Iran. Final do is in sanctions as in policy making, but more so with sanctions, you have to mean it. You have to invest serious political capital to maintain sanctions, because when you impose sanctions, you will get pushback. You'll get it from companies, American and foreign, from foreign governments, and from within, from people in groups both principled and otherwise. We should sanction only when we're willing to go the distance. You have to mean it. Now, there are, in the world of theory about sanctions, there are long-term drawbacks that people talk about. The dollar is by far the world's largest reserve currency, which makes U.S. sanctions particularly powerful. When you combine that with EU financial sanctions and G7 financial sanctions, you're good. But sanctions skeptics point out that overuse of sanctions triggers both tactical retaliation, counter-sanctions, retaliation of some kind or another, but potentially strategic retaliation in the form of long-term steps to limit the dollar's reach. Sanctions are a tool of the strong. That would be our tool, and the tool of the West and the tool of the G7. But we have to make sure that our strength remains commensurate with our ambition, which is a longer-term issue, and it's one well beyond my power to affect. But if I'm going to talk about sanctions specifically, I wanted to start out with some sanctions rules in a general way. And these are not written down as, this is not scripture, this is not policy. These are observations generated from within my office, based on our experience working sanctions around the world. Now, Russia sanctions, and I suppose I've now set myself up because I have to hold up Russia sanctions to the standards I've just set. So, the purpose of the Russia sanctions are not to punish, but to change behavior. That is, specifically, they are intended to advance a political purpose, which is a settlement in Ukraine, and Russia's aggression against Ukraine, of course, was the reason we imposed sanctions in the first place. We didn't impose it for other reasons. We imposed it because Russia had attacked Ukraine first in Crimea and secondly in the Donbass, sending in troops, marked, unmarked, men, weapons, money, with an attempt to annex Crimea, create a separatist rebellion in the Donbass, and chaos generally. The purpose of the US, the European, and the G7 sanctions against Russia are to advance a settlement. Now, the good news is a settlement, or the outlines of a settlement, already exist. It is in the form of what's called the Minsk Accords, which is a series of understandings reached between Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France. And the good news is those accords outline a settlement which is achievable. Roughly, and you can look up the Minsk documents, roughly, Minsk starts with a ceasefire and various other security arrangements. It goes through a political process involving, most importantly, local elections in the Donbass, that is the breakaway parts of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine, and ends with the restoration of the international eastern Ukrainian border. All foreign forces are supposed to be out of Ukraine. They were supposed to be out by now. It's a little more complicated, but basically that's Minsk, and we all support it. We and the Europeans have agreed that we will hold sanctions in place until Minsk is fulfilled, meaning the international border restored. We have all agreed that we will work on Minsk hard. The sanctions program against Russia includes roughly 3 parts. It's some energy sanctions, which are really advanced, or what's known in the trade as frontier oil technology, Arctic, offshore, deep sea, and shale. Financial sanctions, mostly financial restrictions on the big Russian state banks, and sanctions on military and dual-use exports to Russia. And these are US sanctions. European Union sanctions are very close. In fact, as close really as possible to ours, given that the legal systems are different. Plus, there are a lot of individual sanctioned. All of this is public knowledge. You can go look it up. And the G7 has either, Japan has its own sanctions, Canada has its own sanctions very close to ours, Norway, with a lot of energy interests, has sanctions very close to the Europeans, Australia as well. This is a pretty strong G7 set of common sanctions. Now, we think, we're not sure, but we think that the solidarity of the G7 in general, the US and Europe in particular, caught many Russians off guard. We think, we're not sure, that they were not expecting this degree of solidarity. I remember painfully the intra-Western crack-up over the Iraq War. That was awful. That was awful. I hated that. It was painful and costly. And it may be that some Russians overlearned the lessons and thought that Western unity was so fragile it could be undermined, or that the European Union, which requires unanimity of its 28 member states to make sanctions decisions, would never, ever vote sanctions, which, after all, harm some European economies, some more than others, and hit some company interests. Surely, some Russians might have thought, some government will undermine it. But Europe held together. And in a season where there's a lot of, where Europeans and some Americans are expressing skepticism about Europe, and there's a lot of press about Europe's problems, all of which, we can identify. This is an example of European strategic determination and a demonstration of strength for which the Europeans deserve some credit. And for any of you students of US views of the European Union, it's interesting that the so-called European bureaucracy, the Commission and the European Foreign Ministry, the External Action Service, have acted with a strength and determination which is awfully impressive. There were a lot of American skeptics who used to say the Brussels bureaucracy can never get anything done. Well, they got done sanctions, which is a very big deal. Europe deserves a lot of credit for this. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that Minsk is not being implemented very effectively at the moment. The ceasefire, which was basically step one of Minsk, is not, in fact, being honored by the Russians. Most of the violations are on the Russian/separatist side. Under those circumstances, the Ukrainians find it difficult to do things like amend their constitution to fulfill other pieces of Minsk when the first part of Minsk, the security elements, have not been adhered to. But the French and Germans are determined to keep pushing on Minsk, and we believe they are, one, right to keep pushing, and two, we're going to support them hard. We want to maintain sanctions and think we will until Minsk is fulfilled. And by the way, last week the European Union decided to extend the sanctions for another 6 months that were put on Russian individuals, officials, mostly. That's a sign that the press stories and speculation about European support for sanctions crumbling are maybe as exaggerated this time as they were 6-7 months ago when there were similar stories. We think that political will in Europe to continue sanctions is stronger than sanctions opponents make it out to be. We're going to keep working with Europe. We're going to keep holding, well, we want to hold all the parties accountable for Minsk, but we want Russia to do its part. And when Minsk is fulfilled, we will take down the sanctions. Now, with respect to the Crimea sanctions, that is, United States and Europe put on sanctions against Crimea, which can be separated from the other sanctions. And my sense of it is that US and Europe will maintain the Crimea sanctions even after we've taken down the others, as long as Crimea is occupied by the Russians. That's my sense of it. The other sanctions will come down. We'll be happy to do so. We look forward to that day. And in the meantime, we have shown that we are able to cooperate with Russia in some areas. We did so on Iran. We are able to do so on Syria, even as we maintain our sanctions on Ukraine. The United States really can do more than one thing at the same time. And in foreign policy, you have to be able to do that and not be conflicted about it, not tie yourself up in knots about linkage. Now, that's our sanctions program. The Russia sanctions program is the largest sanctions program the United States has ever implemented in terms of the size of the economy we're going after. It is the sanctions program that we have most extensively negotiated with our partners. It is the least unilateral and most multilateral sanctions program we've ever implemented, although I suspect the North Korea sanctions program is headed in that direction because it's strongly based, but not entirely based, on the Security Council resolutions. Still, the Russia sanctions program was negotiated in advance, which is actually interesting. It sets up an interesting and I think very welcome precedent, working with Europe on sanctions and with the G8, G7 on sanctions. Future of sanctions and future of these sanctions in particular. As I said, the purpose of sanctions in general and of these sanctions, and the Russia sanctions in particular, are to create conditions under which you can remove them. So I hope that the sanctions we put in place are short-lived, but we have to mean it, and we do. In the meantime, let's remember why we did this. Ukraine, the precipitating cause of this conflict was Ukraine's desire to sign an association agreement with the European Union, Russia's attempt to block it, Ukrainian demonstrations protesting the Ukrainian government's reversal, the collapse of that Ukrainian government, and a new, much more pro-Western Ukrainian government, which Russia attacked. Ukraine has the right, and we want to give it the opportunity to reform itself and Europeanize itself as far as it is able. How far they do this, whether they can do this, is up to them. They've accomplished more than you'd think if you read the skeptical newspaper stories now, but the skeptical stories are right that they have much more to do. And they're agonizing about this. But we have the opportunity to see a genuinely good outcome in Ukraine, by which I mean a Ukraine which is able to pursue its European or Europeanizing reform vocation as a free country. And then it's up to them. That's not a bad foreign policy objective, and the fact that this is possible is as good as we're likely to get in any real-world foreign policy objective. So there we are. Happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Dan. Really appreciate that very useful examination, both of the do's and don'ts of general sanctions policy, some of which my students from my class this semester might have heard echoes and shades. So I think we're at least still talking about things the same way. And then the review of Russia and Ukraine sanctions. I'll take the privilege of offering just a few questions first, and then we'll go to audience questions and questions that might be coming in from Twitter. The first general question is, frankly, can the Russian economy survive much more of this? I mean, I think if you look at the impact from both the drop in oil prices as well as the impact in terms of Russia's ability to access international debt markets, they're struggling, they're suffering. And I think you might not see a whole lot of that in terms of day-to-day, and the fact that the ruble is depreciated may have given some industries a little bit of a life in Russia, but it seems to me that long-term they're at some risk here. So what's your thinking about Russia's economy, how much longer they can sustain this, and then importantly, what happens the day after Russia's economy really truly tanks?
Well, the worst thing, not the worst thing, but a bad thing to do is to start crowing or proclaiming victory or saying things like, it's going just the way we want it, we've got them just where we want. That's usually in the category of famous last words. The Russian economy has been hurt by sanctions. It's been hurt more by the drop of oil prices. Economists' sort of rule of thumb is maybe 2/3, 3/4 oil prices, the rest sanctions, but there's a relationship between the two. That is, the Russian economy is dependent on the price of commodities, oil and gas, partly because they haven't reformed it that much. It's been 25 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and it is still a commodity-dependent economy. And if they had reformed their economy thoroughly, would there have been this kind of aggression against Ukraine? Now, that's a subject for Harriman Institute seminars rather than me right now, but think about it. So these are related issues. There's no question the Russian economy has been put under pressure because of sanctions, but don't believe me, listen to the Russians themselves. I mean, Vladimir Putin has acknowledged this. There is pressure, and the pressure on the Russian economy is likely to mount. It will grow if we maintain sanctions, and if the expectation in markets remains that sanctions stay in place. The pressure will grow. The theory is, and it's not a secret, this is our open policy, that if the pressure is enough, the Russians will take advantage of the opportunity to make a fair settlement in Minsk, which is balanced and takes some of their legitimate interests into account. That's what we hope happens. Um, every few months I see an economist has written some study, showing that the Russian economy goes on a certain trajectory and in X months it's going to hit the red zone. Well, that's nice. Economic projections are seldom a straight line, but they give us a sense. And our sense of it is that the pressures on the Russian economy will mount. And if we hold firm, and big if the Ukrainians maintain the current macroeconomic stability they've gained, and they work through their current political problems, and they continue the reforms, none of which is guaranteed, all of which are possible, then we're in the much better position of time beginning to work for us. Right? That each month means Ukraine is relatively a little stronger and the pressure on Russia keeps mounting. That's not a bad place to be. And then in the meantime, we have to work the diplomacy of Minsk. Work that hard. And that's not a bad place to be. Now please, don't get the impression I'm just telling you we've won. I don't believe in, you don't win. You do relatively well, or things are slipping away and you're doing relatively poorly. Now we're doing relatively well with the emphasis on the relatively, which is as good as it gets, right? I see Steve Sestanovich is here. My former boss, back so many years ago, I'm embarrassed to say, but ask him about doing relatively well, which is often as good as it gets.
No, thank you for that. One of the questions that's always come up about Russia's sanctions, frankly, is the degree to which they're able to evade some of the implications, including by cooperating with China and taking steps internally and domestically. What's your sense of the degree to which Russia's able to use its relationship with China to its advantage, and to what extent are they able to evade the impact of sanctions altogether through their own internal mechanisms?
Well, for each sanction, we did an internal vet to see how easy evasion would be. So, for instance, the energy technology sanctions, that was actually conceptually the simplest. We picked the areas for which the G7 countries have either a monopoly or a near monopoly of the technology. Like, what's the point going after conventional oil extraction technology to Russia when Russia has its own perfectly adequate conventional oil extraction technology? What they don't have are the exotic technologies. But of course, the low price of oil means that those sanctions are relatively less effective because those exotic technologies those exotic extraction techniques don't pay when oil's at 40. However, financial sanctions are more powerful now relatively, and there's not a lot of backfill, to use the technical term, potential. Sure, Chinese banks to some degree could, but in fact are not, as far as we know, filling in all the gap. And if you believe what's published in the media, and I think it's pretty accurate, the Chinese are driving a pretty hard bargain on some of the Russia gas deals. So it is not quite as easy to get other countries to fill in the gaps when you have G7 countries. I'm not saying there won't be any, but I'm saying we've done all right so far. Sanctions evasion can always be an issue. In fact, it's always an issue. Where you have sanctions, you will have sanctions evasion. And one of the things the United States has done is do something we call sanctions maintenance, a term of art meaning use your existing sanctions authorities and just periodically refresh them with new sanctions designations to go after sanctions evaders. We've issued 2 such lists for Russia, including one around Christmas time. We did it with Iran all the time. You did that. Standard practice, you never catch up 100% with the sanctions evaders, but you don't need 100%. You need a squeeze, you need to make things more difficult. And then that's the category of you better mean it, because it requires resources. You have to put them in. So reasonably effective sanctions. The financial sanctions strong. We'll see how it plays out over time. It'll take a lot of effort to keep them up.
No, I think that all tends to make sense to my own research as well, my own thinking about things. But I think it brings to us a larger strategic sort of question, which is we've now had clashes with the Russians over a number of different policy issues, in this administration as well as previous administrations. And there are a lot of analysts out there who are projecting that we're now entering a new Cold War with Russia. What's your sense of that? I mean, is this just an issue where we've got different sets of interests, different sets of strategies in mind, and there's now competition amongst them as before in the 90s there wasn't? Or are we really in a new paradigm with the Russians?
Certainly, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, the second time Russia's gone after one of its neighbors, first being Georgia in 2008, has caused a major shift in Western governments' approach to Russia. And how could it not? How could it not? For years and years after the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall and end of the Iron Curtain, NATO was focusing more on expeditionary capabilities, missions in Afghanistan, actions in Iraq. And it still needs to maintain that capacity. But look what we've all read recently about NATO's plans. I wouldn't say it's a new Cold War, because that evokes images that aren't accurate or instructive. And certainly we can cooperate and are cooperating with Russia in areas where it's still in our interest. Iran, Syria. And we should. And that should not cause us to agonize. As I said, we need to be able to do more than one thing at the same time. And again, Steve Stasanovich knows all about these debates as far back as the Reagan administration, where we debated pointlessly issues of linkage, meaning how can you cooperate with the Soviets on issue X when they're doing bad things on issue Y? And the answer was, why not? Like, if the cooperation is in our interest, why is that our problem? You neither have to pay the Russians in advance for cooperation in issues, nor feel guilty about cooperating with them. Just do it when it is in your interest. And that's a very sound practice, which this administration is implementing with some skill. And I'm not the Russia policy person, so I can say things like some skill, and it's not a pat on my own back.
Raising the issue of U.S. Views on Russia and the Soviet Union in the 80s, brings to mind the issue of energy security and the degree to which Europe remains dependent on Russia for its energy supplies. My own sense has been for a while that the Europeans need to rethink this, not simply because of Russia, but rather it's not terribly wise to be dependent on anyone for your energy supplies. Do you have a sense that that's a viewpoint that's really gained any ground inside of Europe? What's your thinking about how the Europeans now see their energy security vis-a-vis Russia?
Well, it's interesting that, all right, so this is an election year, I think we've noticed, and it is, let us say, customary to talk about partisan divides and sharp breaks, but the question, the policy response to the question you just asked has been relatively consistent since the Clinton administration. Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration. The U.S. has sought to work with Europe to lessen Europe's dependence on Russian energy and particularly gas supplies, to weaken Russian leverage to use that gas supply for political purposes and has enjoyed some success. And this has been a cooperative venture. Again, 3 administrations working in the same direction, many of the same assumptions, many of the same people. I know it's not the fashion to talk about bipartisan or nonpartisan cooperation on strategic issues, but there it is, just fact. And 10 years ago, the Europeans they were still debating whether this could actually work, whether you could, in fact, continue to purchase gas from Russia because they need to, but at the same time diversify sources and proliferate gas conduits so that the shutdown of no one pipeline could cause you to have a major crisis. It was a Hungarian energy company official who put it to me this way: we in Europe are developing capillaries, smaller pipelines, so that if somebody steps on an artery, we don't have a heart attack. It's actually a pretty good metaphor for what the Europeans were doing with gas, which means they were building smaller pipelines to take gas from old Western Europe, Germany, to old Eastern Europe, Slovakia, Hungary. That gas might be Russian-sourced, but it meant that the Russians could not cut off a vulnerable East European company at will. At the same time, we're working on diversification of sources. US LNG beginning to come online, other sources, North African, maybe in the future Mediterranean. So the gas picture, and plus the massive increase in US domestic production affects markets. Even if we don't export gas, we use domestic gas and import less. So the strategic picture of gas has been shifting over the past 10 years, much in favor of the West, and it's one of these tectonic shifts which doesn't get noticed while it's happening until it gets noticed all at once. And it's a fairly big deal. And again, continuity. It's really quite interesting to watch, having saw the Bush administration and then the Obama administration come into office. It was interesting that you could see the new folks coming to the same conclusions from different starting points, but responding with an overall sense of American interest. I mean, it's almost, high-minded civics. And I mention it because this is not such a high-minded season, perhaps. So, some good news.
Thank you for that. Again, for those who are watching us online or listening to this as a podcast, my name is Richard Nephew, and I'm here with Dan Freed, who's the coordinator for sanctions policy at the U.S. Department of State. I think we'll now transition to start taking some questions from the audience, including our online audience. I already have one question that I'll put to you. The question is that would Russian sanctions be as effective without the oil price collapse, and have U.S. producers benefited from that?
Probably not. That is, if the price of oil were $140 a barrel, the oil technology sanctions would be more impactful and more powerful, the financial sanctions less impactful, and the overall balance would have been somewhat less powerful sanctions. So I'll acknowledge that. But, okay, sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you get it lucky, and I'm not complaining. The second part of the question?
Whether or not U.S. producers have benefited.
Well, I don't think so. I think the drop of oil prices has hit U.S. shale producers reasonably hard.
Yeah, that would be my view as well. I think that if in fact the oil price hadn't dropped and production from Russia had started to go down, you could potentially make an argument there. But with the oil price having gone down as far as it has, I don't think U.S. producers are feeling terribly comfortable right now. Yeah.
That's the world of commodity prices, though the overall impact on the American economy demonstrates just how diversified and resilient our economy is compared to the impact on us, compared to the impact on Russia.
Yeah, very much agreed. All right, we're going to take questions from the audience, and Julie is back there with the microphones. Oh, there we go. All right, we'll go up front first.
Sure.
And please just state your name and affiliation, and then go over the question.
Hello, I'm Ilya Zaslavsky, energy consultant, and I research Russia energy and sanctions with Chatham House and Legatum Institute and some DC think tanks. First question is on why there are so few oligarchs on Russia sanctions list. There is Timchenko, Rottenberg, but supposedly the criteria is closeness to Putin and involvement with the policies of the regime. But say Mikhail Friedman and Petr Avin or Abramovich and Usmanov really they have the same criteria. And I don't know, in Ukrainian government, many people are unhappy with negative influence of Alpha Bank in Ukraine. Meanwhile, they take money from Sechin and buy assets, energy assets in Europe and elsewhere, circumventing sanctions, essentially. So doesn't that make sanctions superficial if you just go after technology and financial resources? Second question on Belarusian, on lifting of Belarusian sanctions. So Lukashenko just removed he released political prisoners, but nothing else changed. His policy, he remains an autocrat. Many people see it as a blow to Western foreign policy and its essence. It really didn't change the regime. So any thoughts on this are welcome. Thanks.
You are right that we distinguished in the sanctions between so-called cronies and oligarchs. Oligarchs are the class of the super wealthy business people. Cronies are a subset of that class, the ones who are particularly close to the regime, let us say. We have sanctioned Timchenko, the Rottenberg brothers, and others. We have, and this is public knowledge, we have sanctioned their assets, both in Russia and in Europe, and some of their agents in Europe and Russia. We have distinguished between the oligarchs and the cronies for that reason, and we intend to. You talked about future sanctions. It's a fair question, but I'm not going anywhere near future possibilities. But we are aware of we stay abreast and we attempt to stay abreast of all issues of sanctions evasion. That's why my colleagues at the Treasury Department, consulting with State, came up with not one but two so-called sanctions maintenance lists, both of which had included designations of cronies and their assets. Again, public knowledge. That's pretty strong stuff, and it was noticed, including in Russia, by all kinds of people. With respect to Belarus sanctions, yes, the Lukashenko government released all the political prisoners. We felt, since we had urged him to do so and said that that was a major step for us, we had to respond. We did respond with a suspension of sanctions, not a permanent removal of the sanctions. Europe went a little bit farther. I understand your point about President Lukashenko. We're not naive, we're not dumb. And we are not giving up on our aspirations for a different kind of future for Belarus, but we felt we had to take this step. And we're in close touch with Belarusian society. That's really all I want to say about that right now in this forum, but I understand the point you're making.
All right, thank you very much. All right, we'll go with this lady up here. Pass the microphone. You got it? Thank you.
Hi, my
And
name
please,
is...
again, state your affiliation and your question.
Olia Schechter. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm making a documentary about pro-Russian rebels in Donbass right now. So I just came back from there, and they're convinced that it is Poroshenko is the one who is not keeping his end of the promise by not giving autonomy to Donbass under the Minsk agreement. And I know that Hollande and Merkel just went to speak with him in Kiev, and they've tried to convince him, but he did not have enough votes in Rada to pass that
Right.
legislation. Can you
Yeah.
comment on that, please? Thank you.
Well, every party, the Russians and Ukrainians both have obligations under Minsk. Ukrainians do too. But we all understand that it's hard for the Ukrainians to take steps that are sort of second phase Minsk, so to speak, when the first phase, the ceasefire, hasn't been implemented. We actually understand that. And the Ukrainians' point is, how do you expect us to take these difficult political steps when our soldiers are being killed almost every day, when there are ceasefire violations, most of, or if not all of which, most of, overwhelming majority of which are the responsibility of the separatists and therefore the Russians? Now, point. Everyone has to fulfill Minsk, but we can't expect one party to do it alone. So and it is, Ukraine doesn't have troops in Russia, okay? It isn't sending volunteers over to Krasnodar or Rostov. So we all understand the position the Ukrainians are in. Again, they have their responsibilities also. There's a lot they have to do, including advancing their reforms. I spent a lot of time after 1989 working with the Central Europeans, the Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, and later the Baltic states. And one of the things they did was generate their own political capital for themselves through successful implementation of reforms. They didn't quite realize it when they were doing it, but the further they went down the reform path, the more support they generated in Europe and the United States. And that's not an abstract, that's not an empty promise. That really worked out quite well for them. They're all in NATO and the European Union. And I remember they used to say, you know, thank you, America, for helping. And I used to say back to them, don't thank us. Because had you failed with your reforms, I wouldn't take the blame. So I'm not going to take the credit now. You did this. You opened the door. And that's the lesson the Ukrainians need to understand. They can open their own road to Europe. I mean, in the civilizational sense, I'm not talking about EU membership. I'm talking about the sense in which the people on the Maidan were flying the European flag. We want a better future for ourselves, for our children, for our country. A reforming Ukrainian government, or a Ukrainian government that gets, let's say, a second wind at reforms because they've done a lot, is one which is going to have more support in Europe, and it will strengthen the people in Europe who want to help them. Now, they may think that's just an American dodge, you know, telling them to do the hard work of reforms, but that's based on experience. The Ukrainians, it is interesting to see the Ukrainian national identity crystallized through this process. And it's hard for them. Completely, in some sense, you know, they're way past the red zone in terms of stress. But it is also a time of extraordinary politics where countries can do things that cannot be done under ordinary conditions. And I hope they find the courage to keep going, which is an indirect way of answering your fair question. And good luck with that documentary, and be careful out there.
All right, we'll take the gentleman in the back with the glasses, right next to you. Yeah, there you go.
Eric Chenoweth with the Institute for Democracy in Eastern Europe. Hello. When the Crimea sanctions were first imposed, it was announced that these were limited sanctions and that they would be graduated until Crimea was sovereignty was returned to Ukraine. Additional sanctions now appear to be no longer tied to the annexation of Crimea, and the annexation, the return of Crimea to Ukraine is now a secondary goal. Is that true? And have all of the other sanctions been disassociated from the annexation?
Well, at the beginning, in the beginning, we responded first to Russia's aggression against Ukraine through the attack on an attempted annexation of Crimea. And we said exactly, pretty much as you just outlined, that we would put on sanctions and there would be more, and I think we've done that. That is, Russian aggression continued and our sanctions escalated. They mounted. We had several executive orders. The first one was in response to Crimea, but then we built on them. And then the fourth executive order, the most recent one with respect to Ukraine and Russia, was on Crimea only. Now, what we have said is that we will take down the Russia-related sanctions if Minsk is fulfilled, but keep on the Crimea-related sanctions, which were designed to be separable. And I think the Europeans will do the same thing. What that means, in effect, is that if we get to a Minsk settlement with the Donbass in a sovereign Ukraine and the eastern Ukrainian border restored, yeah, we will take down the sanctions. And then we will maintain, my sense of it is we will maintain the Crimea-related sanctions, which means, in effect, you have a kind of long-term non-recognition policy like the non-recognition policy of the Baltic annexation by the Soviet Union, except that non-recognition policy had no sanctions attached, or very few, and this one would. So it's actually tougher than the Baltic non-recognition policy. But we have agreed, and the Europeans have agreed, to remove sanctions once Minsk is fulfilled, and we can't credibly move the goalposts. We've got to be straight and honest about this. And the Ukrainians know this. We have not kept this a secret from them.
We got the gentleman up front here.
Hi, my name is Lasha Shanidze. I represent Millennium Capital Group. We focus on former Soviet Union. My question is twofold. You mentioned here Georgia has predated the Ukraine crisis, and I wanted to ask you a question. Would the U.S., by imposing similar sanctions when Georgian war took place and Russia occupied Georgian territory in 2008, could have somehow avoided the crisis that we have in Ukraine, one, and two, today we still don't have anything related to Georgia as a sanction. And how come, first of all, and could have not been a good time to include somehow Georgian sanctions, Georgia-related sanctions against Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question and a valid one. And I'm going to I have no recourse but to really tell you the truth, at least as I see it. I was Assistant Secretary for Europe at the time of the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, so I remember this. And the fact is, we did consider sanctions briefly, but we didn't impose them for a couple of reasons. First, we didn't have unity with Europe. There were differences between the United States and Europe and among European countries about Georgia. That is, Chancellor Merkel was much more skeptical about Saakashvili and about Georgia than she was about Ukraine and after the Maidan. So we would not have had the kind of US-European Union, we wouldn't have had that silver standard, right, the multilateral sanctions. Secondly, we had fought hard about Georgia months before over the question of NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit. And so there was a lot of raw feeling. And the Bush administration was out of time and out of steam and didn't have the political capital to do what was needed. Now, that's not a great answer for you, but that's the truth. And the other reason was that we were not nearly as good at sanctions in 2008 as we later became. And so the sanctions we would have imposed wouldn't have been nearly as smart. We got a lot better, mainly because of our practice over Iran. So by the time it was 2014 and Ukraine sanctions, people in the U.S., there was a deep knowledge of sophisticated, smart sanctions, which we could draw on that we just didn't have in 2008. So what we did in 2008, after the war for Georgia, was stabilize the economy. You remember, there was fear that it could collapse, and we organized several $1 billion, and the United States put in $1 billion, and now I want to give, in the cynical political season, right, I want to give a shout out to non-political good government thinking. The person responsible more than anybody else for that $1 billion was then vice presidential candidate Joe Biden, who said that the U.S. government, the Bush administration, ought to put up $1 billion for Georgia. And in the White House and State Department, we heard it and we embraced it because, one, we knew Biden was right, and two, we knew what he was doing, which was taking the issue out of the campaign and giving us the running room to do it. I mean, I'm still impressed. There was no political profit whatsoever for a vice presidential candidate, Biden, but he was doing the right thing for the right reason and helping the Bush administration do the right thing. Basically saying, do the right thing and I'll back you, and it'll be out of the political campaign. We embraced it. I mean, the Bush White House moved immediately to follow vice presidential candidates Biden's advice. So, you know, for everybody cynical about American politics, it was really nice to see everybody doing the right reason, the right thing for the right reason. And I went back to the campaign, you know, the Obama-Biden campaign, and said, guys, you just have done a great thing for the common cause. Now, we did help the Georgian economy. In retrospect, yeah, you might be right. That is, had we had the political capital to invest in sanctions on Russia because of the Georgian war, had we been able to do it, it might have stopped what happened in Ukraine. So I'll accept that. I don't know that you're right, but it's a reasonable hypothesis. But I'm telling you why we didn't do it, and I'm trying to give you a real-world sense of what happened. I feel good that we did the right thing for Georgia on the economy. Georgia's still here. It's still a free country. It didn't collapse. And in the end, the Russians didn't gain they didn't gain very much. They didn't gain hardly any territory. They formally but they recognized what they already had splintered away. But I'm not saying a little bit. You know, I know the villages. I mean, I've been up to the border. So I know what you're talking about. And I get the point. But that's what we did. We're a lot smarter about sanctions now than we were. When I think of the sanctions against Milosevic, they were, you know, we tried, but they were much less smart. Not because people didn't care, but because we didn't have the institutional sophistication and capacity to do it. We learned how to do this slowly. And after 9/11 and after the Iran. So that's a longer answer than maybe you wanted. But frankly, I've had this question from Georgians before, and it's a fair question. And that's a real world answer, as best, you know, from my perspective.
So we're approaching the end. What we'll do is we'll take two questions at once, one from this side of the room, from this side of the room. We'll take them both, and then Dan will answer, and we'll do that as long as we can until we run out of time. So let's go with the gentleman all the way in the back over on this side. Let's go with the lady up front here on this side. I don't know where the microphone is.
Thank you. My name is Jim Dingman. I'm from Pacifica Radio. The question is, when you look at trade sanctions in the past, that is South Africa, they achieved a 0.5 reduction in GDP over time. What are you aiming for in this? And also, that was aimed to overthrow the government, which it ultimately did have a factor in doing. So what is the hit on the GDP of Russia that you're seeking to get to see them cry uncle? And what do you think will be the possible outcome politically, domestically?
All right, and then this lady up here. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I'm Roma Stibrovy, president of NGO Sustainability. One question you haven't dealt with at all is the feeling among many Eastern European experts that we should have kept out of Ukraine, that the EU should not have offered them status, and then this whole situation wouldn't have occurred, because there is a very real Russian fear and interest in their borders. The other thing is, you didn't mention the UN sanctions in Iraq and what we might have learned from this oil for food program.
First, the objective of our sanctions on Russia is not to get them to cry uncle. It is to convince them to respect the Minsk agreements and implement them. That's what we seek. It's specific. You can run the numbers about the economic hit that Russia is taking, and sanctions part in that. Significant and at the margin important. We're looking for impact to change the context in which the Russian leadership makes its calculations. We're not, but we're not looking for more than that. We're looking for the change in behavior in general, and specifically Minsk. With respect to Ukraine, I don't know which Eastern European experts you have in mind. The Eastern Europeans themselves are very happy to support Ukraine. They're the ones who want to see Ukraine enjoy a European future. In my view, the Ukrainians get a vote about their own future. It is the Ukrainians who wanted to draw closer to Europe, because it seems they thought of that as a civilizational choice. To them, Europe meant less corruption, a more normal country, more reform. Now, we know from post-communist experience that such reforms are possible in former communist countries, even former Soviet space, the Baltics, Georgia. It's not easy. But I don't know what keeping out of Ukraine means. That means what? Telling the Ukrainian people that their interest in the West doesn't matter, that they actually are part of Russia's sphere of influence? That's hard for any American government to accept, and almost impossible to articulate. With respect to the Iraq sanctions, that's actually a pretty good point. If I could turn back the clock, I'd like to go back and tell myself at the beginning of the Bush administration, don't give up on the UN sanctions on Iraq. Make them smarter, and it might actually work. The sanctions in place are pretty crude and pretty dumb. And there's massive headroom to do it right. What would have happened had we given that another try instead of assuming that the sanctions wouldn't work? Well, I don't know. There are so many what-ifs with respect to Iraq. But I remember the early days of the Bush administration, when it was assumed, and not just by the Bush administration, but by most of the experts, that sanctions had failed. Oil for food was a disaster, which in fact it was. But we hadn't enough confidence in sanctions, sort of an Iraq version of the Georgia problem. We didn't know how good sanctions could be. And I wish I could go back and say, wait, hire these 5 people, promote them at Treasury, hire find Richard Nephew, in the bureaucracy, put them to work on Iraq sanctions, and you won't have to start thinking about other options. I wish. Okay?
And I think we've got time for just one more question. We're going to go with this gentleman right here.
Oh, there. My name is Devansh. I'm from the journalism school over here.
Yeah.
So I want to basically ask that, are these sanctions kind of creating a second block of power? I mean, if you look at recent developments, Russia set up a $10 billion emergency fund with Saudi Arabia called the RDIF. SWIFT, which is a hugely important system for bank transfers and is the only one in the world, Russia and China are now developing their own alternative to SWIFT.
Yeah.
And China and Russia also signed a 38-point agreement. So, I mean, is this kind of dividing the world into 2 blocks, and is this what the sanctions are achieving?
You remember at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned about strategic retaliation and long-term steps to limit the dollar. It was this kind of thing I had in mind. And this often comes up. People raise what you just raised and said all sanctions will do is drive countries to create their own alternative, In theory, I get the problem. In practice, not so much. It's easy to talk about a SWIFT. It's hard to put one together. Remember Comic-Con? Yeah, but barely, right? See what I mean? I mean, the child's second-rate copies of real institutions are usually second-rate. And it's easier to talk about that than to do. And if this is a hypothetical, but if there were if a country had the rule of law developed and financial regulations developed to the point where it was credible and could create its own SWIFT, then it might not be the kind of country that felt it needed to invade its neighbors, right? Which is not, I'm not giving you that as a law of politics, but why are there any other institutions that works as effectively as SWIFT in those countries? Right. You see my point. But a cautionary note. We need to keep investing in our own strength. We cannot take for granted that our institutions will perpetuate themselves without our stir. This is a season in which liberal institutions are treated either too often taken for granted or treated with disdain by, let us say politely, political forces on both sides of the Atlantic. That's, I trust, polite enough. And we can't take that for granted. SWIFT, our banking system regulation, is the result of a lot of work to safeguard what are known as the global commons, the product of America's investment in the liberal world order. That's a source of strength, but you got to invest in it, and you have to mean it, okay? I could say a lot more, but maybe not, in an on-the-record session.
Well, that actually transitioned us nicely. I want to thank everybody for joining us here and joining us online. As I mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. You can also subscribe to our podcast series on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and lots of other platforms. This is one of a number of great events that we're hosting in the coming weeks. The biggest that's coming up soon is the 2016 Global Energy Summit. Wednesday, April 27th, 1 to 5:30 p.m. in the Low Memorial Library Rotunda at Columbia University, and also will be streamed online. We hope to see you all again real soon, and please join me in thanking Dan for coming here with us today.